The president's trip did come with some backlash. The head of Georgia's Democratic Party calling him out for stopping to make a campaign promise instead of, quote, checking on the sick and vulnerable in the state. Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden releasing a statement for Georgians ahead of the president's visit. Biden writing, quote, Georgia families are suffering. The former vice president says they're suffering because of President Trump's complete and utter failure to lead this country and combat the spread of COVID-19. Those are his words. Biden went on to say Americans need a concrete, effective reopening plan that's rooted in science and public health. A new national poll showing Biden with a double-digit lead over President Trump. The NBC Wall Street Journal poll showing 51% of voters would vote for Biden if the election were held right now. 40% support President Trump. Now to some other top stories we're following on this Thursday morning.